Hello, friends. Asha Dyer here. Welcome to this special Repro Film mini podcast episode as part of our Films for Thought partnership with WISP, a company that specializes in female-focused online reproduction and sexual health treatment. We've partnered with WISP to present a Repro Film movie night on college campuses across the US. At Repro Film, we believe in conversation and filmmaking as a vehicle for sparking change, and I'm so excited to be presenting these interviews with some brilliant filmmakers. Today, I'm speaking with Jessie Zinn and Aurora Brachman. Jessie is an award-winning director from Cape Town, South Africa. Her work often stems from ideas surrounding girlhood and coming-of-age stories. Aurora Brachman is an award-winning documentary director and cinematographer. Her films explore narratives of intimate relationships within families and communities. Aurora primarily makes work about the experiences of Black, brown, and queer people and is committed to collaborative and ethical storytelling. Jessie and Aurora directed the brilliant short film, The Gallery That Destroys All Shame. The film documents a group of women who gather one night in Los Angeles to hear from two sex educators, Pamela and Michael, who teach the women how to overcome shame and stigma around their bodies, and in particular their vulvas, in a workshop titled Take Back the Speculum. When I was watching this film, it made me hold a juxtaposition of feelings all at once. Empowerment and admiration for the women in this room unashamedly looking at their vulvas in front of a mirror and supporting one another as they shared their stories. And yet I also felt shock, anxiety, confrontation, and shame, clearly internalizing all the messages I've been taught throughout my own life about my body and what it should or shouldn't do or be like. And this is exactly why this film is so important. What the educators in the film are doing is incredibly disruptive in an empowering and freeing way. So I am thrilled to be having a conversation with Jessie and Aurora about their work and how it can be a tool for changing the cultural status quo about bodies, sexuality, and gender. Aurora and Jessie, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. I'm really excited to dive in and talk about all things The Gallery That Destroys All Shame. But first, I'd love to learn about how did the film come about? How did you both meet? How did you decide to make this wonderful film?
Yeah, so Jessie and I met because we were in the same cohort. We were in the documentary film MFA program at Stanford, and we were in the same cohort, and we very quickly became really great friends. Jessie and I don't know, we very quickly were like gravitational pull, like we need to make a film together. And in fact, we initially had not been paired to make a film, and we sort of broke up with the people we were supposed to make the film with and eloped and made our film together. And Jessie really wanted to make a film that had something to do with reproductive justice or something to do with reproductive health. And I had been living in Los Angeles prior to coming to Stanford, and a friend of mine had told me when I was living in LA about this amazing class that she had taken where people all gathered together and displayed their vulvas for each other and would like talk about their like vulva or their vagina stories. I think we both pretty instantly were just like, I think this could be in a really amazing potential space for a film. I'd love to hear what Jessie thinks, but that's sort of my collection.
Yeah, it's funny because as soon as Aurora mentioned the idea, we both instantly were like, oh, this is the film. And everyone in our cohort had been encouraged by our professors to sort of seek out alternative options for films. And so like I feel like Aurora and I were like coerced into like maybe like backtracking or backpedaling on like our initial idea, which was this amazing class. So but straight from the bat, we were like, oh my gosh, we have the greatest feeling, gut instinct reaction to this idea. And then it's interesting because it's the only film to date that I've ever worked on where every single choice has been made instantly and has been the right choice, and we've stuck to it. And it's like, I feel like with this film, it was something from the beginning, even in the development phase, where when we knew that it was right, it was right. Like, for example, we were having a conversation with Pam when we were doing research, and she mentioned this one part of the class, which we'll get into in a bit, called The Gallery That Destroys All Shame. And I remember it so clearly because I was sitting next to Aurora. We were like sitting in my dorm room, and I turned to Aurora and I was like, that's the name of the film. And then she turned to me and she's like, yes. And then it was the name. And it stayed like that. And in the documentary world, where things change so much, it's like quite rare for that to happen. And so I don't know, Aurora, if you disagree with any of those points.
No, I agree. I feel like our instincts initially were the entire film is going to take place in the space of the class. We're not going to have interviews. We're not like we knew we wanted it to be this very contained story, and we felt like that could sustain it. And we knew we wanted, well, I don't know that this is in the version of the film that's being shared, but we knew that we felt really strongly about having imagery of vulvas, like we were going to film people's vulvas. And like Jessie said, I do feel like it just sort of felt like everything aligned, and like we were very sure of the direction we wanted to take the project in, and we kind of didn't sway from it. And we obviously, when you're in grad school, their purpose is to challenge you. You know, you're constantly being critiqued, you're constantly getting feedback, and I think that Jessie and I had a very clear vision. And when we finished shooting the film, we went to In-N-Out. Because we shot the entire film in one evening. We went to In-N-Out. We both looked at each other and we were like, "Oh my God, I think we just shot like a really good film." You know? We just kind of knew. We were like, it felt like we had just had like a psychedelic experience or something. Because the experience of being there is just like there's this incredible energy. It's like very electric. It's like people becoming incredibly vulnerable and probably surpassing some of their own personal boundaries, not in a way that's sort of like violating, but like in a sense of like, what are you comfortable sharing? Like most of these people had never been in an environment like this before. There was something incredibly surreal about witnessing it and then leaving and being like, I think we got that on camera and this is a story we can share. And it was really beautiful.
We also knew that, like, in terms of our approach, that we both had our ethical approaches to the format of documentary filmmaking aligned, which also was really important when it came to a film like this, because we knew what we didn't want to do. We knew that we didn't want to exploit any people, exploit any stories for the sake of storytelling. We were just like aligned from the beginning. We sort of also understood the way that each other works, which I think going into a film like this, you have to have this sense of mutual trust and an understanding in terms of the approaches to the actual filmmaking itself.
You can tell when you watch it that there is ethical consideration taken into account. And I love that you both as filmmakers, you know, you had to balance this instinctual creative magic, I want to call it, with the institution telling you, well, let's just backpedal on that, or let's just hold on, let's revise that. I mean, it's kind of like what filmmakers deal with on a daily basis, whether it's academic institutions or brands or studios saying, well, hang on, but then there's like the creative magic. You just know instinctively that you had something great. So, and I mentioned in my introduction, which I recorded separately, how watching this film myself, even as someone who considers myself very forward thinking and open, and also having given birth in a hospital setting with multiple people hovering around my vagina and vulva and watching a baby be pushed out, it was confronting to watch this film and really made me interrogate my own feelings around why do I feel uncomfortable watching it. And side note, which I mentioned to both of these amazing ladies off this call, was that Michael Schifra, who's featured in the film, was my doula when I gave birth to my daughter. And so I feel like there's some beautiful full circle moment here. But it brings me to my question. What have been some of the responses from viewers that you've received since it's been released?
I think that in terms of the sort of formal distribution of the film, it was still being distributed to film festivals and so on during COVID. And so I can't speak for Aurora, but I've actually never been at an in-person live screening of the film. So I can't talk on behalf of that experience, but I have watched it with a lot of friends and acquaintances. I think what's really interesting to me, more so, of course, when women and femmes and queer people watch the film, there's a varied set of responses. Like some people are like, oh, well, I've always known this and I've always spoken openly about my body. Whereas other people are like, I've never spoken about my body and this felt extremely confrontational. So I think it's important to note that there's a spectrum of experiences that people interact and engage with when they're watching the film. Because for some people, it's not controversial at all. There are very few people in the world, but some people have grown up without that sense of shame in their households or in their communities and so on. But I think what's been really interesting to me is when men or male or cishet men watch the film, that those responses are always what really, really interests me, because I think one of the beautiful things about this film, which also has to be carefully considered, of course, because it's a safe space for women, for femmes, for queer people, is that it's a space that normally cishet men wouldn't have access to. And so what's been really interesting is just hearing the responses from the male-bodied people that watch the film, and often just the sense of surprise and incredible appreciation for all the people in the film that shared their stories, because it gave them a point of reference to understand. I think that's what inherently documentary filmmaking is about. It's about trying to spread awareness and impact society through personalized stories, because I think it makes it more universal. It humanizes things. The film is not, let me make this very clear, the film is not made for men at all. Aurora and I, from the very get-go, we were like, this is a film for women, for female-bodied people, femmes, queers, and non-binary. It's made it more interesting when men come into contact with the film, because we didn't necessarily make it for them. And the responses are overwhelmingly positive when they do watch the film.
You're right. I think some of the strongest reactions have been from men. Because I think for men, it's like such a novel conversation. And like Jessie said, a space that they're typically not privy to. And so that has been remarkable. And like I remember someone had DM'd me after a film festival that she had like seen it and she'd watched it with her like 80-year-old father or something. And it's like a parent who they'd never had a conversation about sex or sexuality at all in her entire life with her father. And afterwards, it had sort of like unlocked and begun a dialogue that they could have. So I think that that's really beautiful, that people that it's reaching who, for whatever reason, this is entirely new. And I think it has a lot of power. But then I think what's also been really interesting, sort of like you shared, Asha, is like even for people who think of themselves as being maybe more, I don't know, sexually progressive or something, the number of people who have told me, this makes me really uncomfortable. And I think that that's interesting. Like a lot of people have told me watching your film made me very uncomfortable. And I think that the fact that even if we grow up inside of a community where these conversations are more normalized, and maybe we did have more access to information about like reproductive health and about our sexual lives that wasn't presented in a way that's like fear mongering, you know, I still think that we grow up within a society that imbues us with some of these values, whether we want to take them on or not. And I think that the film challenges everyone. It challenges me. I mean, Jessie and I, we never used the speculum, you know, like there was a conversation about like, should we use it and should we like participate in the class? And partially we didn't do that because like logistically it wouldn't have made sense. Like we needed to shoot. I think we'd be lying to say if we weren't, that we even ourselves were not squeamish about doing that and about sharing in that way. What it comes up for you is sort of a reflection of like, what are you carrying maybe that you don't realize you're still holding?
Totally. I mean, I remember at the end of our shoot, like, and I think that at the time we'd ascribed this to the fact that we were just absolutely exhausted from shooting. But I remember that I think both Aurora and I definitely remember that I did it. I can't speak for Aurora factually, but I burst into tears. We went into the bedroom and we were like collating all of the memory cards. And I remember just bawling my eyes out. But we were both so emotional after the class. And I think that often we think that it's like adrenaline relating to shooting and filming and being very busy. But I think it was that exposure to people, you know, literally sharing and bearing both their bodies and their souls and their stories in this very vulnerable, safe space that we'd never been exposed to ever before. And so not only experiencing that with a camera, documenting it for the first time, but also experiencing it personally for the first time, I think was very intense and beautiful, but also very intense.
What a powerful experience for you both as filmmakers, and hearing those reactions from various people is really fascinating, especially men. I love hearing that. That's really. And before we go on with the rest of the questions, I want to just get you to quickly outline who the main two characters in the film are, the educators, and what the workshop, the Take Back the Speculum workshop is, just for people who haven't watched the film or are yet to watch the film.
The Gallery That Destroys All Shame is a film that takes place purely in the space of this workshop that happens. This particular one takes place in Los Angeles, called Take Back the Speculum. And I would equate it to sort of like an adult sex ed class that's specifically aimed at people with internal anatomy, so like women, but also obviously people who like are assigned female at birth but may not identify as women. The first half of the class is sort of like they sort of share different information about internal anatomy that maybe you wouldn't have learned growing up and you don't know just from your time at the gynecologist, and sort of about empowering people with information about like what's going on down there, and so that it's not something that's hidden and secret, but that they hold the knowledge of that. And then the second half of the class, which is what the film primarily focuses on, where one at a time they go up and they sort of display their vulvas for the class, and they speak about their like vulva story or their vagina story, basically their history with their own anatomy. Some people talk about masturbation when they were a child and their first experiences with that. Some people talk about the births they've experienced. Some people share about sexual assault that they have experienced in their lives. And the entire class is run by Pamela, who's like a really brilliant sex educator. And I also think she's like a body worker. And she facilitates this. It happens monthly. And we were very privileged to be able to attend just one class. We wanted to attend multiple, and she said, no, you can just do one. When we shot the film, it was the first time we had ever witnessed the class. We'd never seen it before. And we only had that like couple of hours one evening in Silver Lake to shoot the thing. And that's sort of what it is. Yeah.
It's amazing. And Michael Schiffer, who is her mentee, you mentioned, or her partner in these workshops, correct?
Yeah, and Michael is also featured in the film. I think it's just like an Easter egg. Like if you knew Michael, you'd see her. I don't know if she speaks, but you definitely see her, and she has a great shirt on that has a vibrator and it says "The wand chooses the wizard," right?
So iconic.
And she was sort of like was mentored by her, and now I think they're sort of partners in the work that they do.
Going back to your question about who the main characters are, or like, I think it's such an interesting question, because I think when Aurora and I were sitting down and editing the film, like the main character is the vulva. And that's the thing. It's about a class of collective experiences. And of course, this collective experience has different sects and different sections of individual experiences and stories and memories. But when we were crafting it in the edit, which we can get into it another time, it was a whole other process. I think we had a very strong vision that we wanted it to feel like it was this concise one film that encapsulates the idea behind the class, which is this thing of the vulva and the vagina. And so when I think of the main character, I think of vulvas and vaginas rather than individual people.
Yeah, I love that shift in perspective. I think that's really fascinating, and it really makes you think. Thank you for shifting my perspective on that. I think that's really important. So I hope people keep that in mind as they watch the film. I know we mentioned men before and male-bodied people, but one of the big juxtapositions that we see in pop culture is how male genitalia is seen as a symbol of power and authority and glorification, and whereas female genitalia, although highly exploited and objectified in many types of media, is typically seen as something shameful, something to be hidden, which is the complete opposite of what we see in your film. So why do you think that taboo on that juxtaposition still exists today? I know that's a loaded question.
Like we need to get like a sociologist in here.
You know what? I think that when you talk about the quote unquote society, I think that it's important to differentiate between different societies, because intersectionally and culturally, there are different societies and there are different ways and thoughts and models of thought that govern different societies. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind. For example, I come from South Africa, where there are definitely similarities and parallels. But when you talk about sex education and reproductive health, it operates on a very different level. So with that being said, I'm going to let Aurora, as a designated American, to take this question.
Thank you for that perspective, Jessie. I appreciate it.
I mean, it's such a big question. I think, okay, yeah, if we're going to get to the level of society, I mean, I guess if we're speaking from an American perspective, I think we would probably have to think like historically, right? Like what we come from a society that was like founded by Puritans. I think that there's always been a thought that like you need to control women's sexualities, like that it's dangerous, that it's like if we're talking about the story of Adam and Eve, because we're going biblical here, in that creation story, like she is the one who wants to like take the apple of knowledge, like she wants to learn, but in that she damns all of humanity. So it's like obviously there are like deeply rooted sort of thoughts and fears about women and women accessing knowledge. And I think that's like deeply interconnected with an idea of like a knowledge of your own body, a sense of like self-empowerment over the choices that are made around your body. I mean, we look at the United States, like abortion is now illegal in more than 50% of the states, the United States. Like this is not just historical, like these historical roots, I think, are, not to continue with this metaphor, but like bearing fruit today in a very real way. So very fascinating, even in our attempts to distribute this film. The film did not have an incredibly robust festival life. And we also struggled to get any form of distribution. And that was always because we show nudity, because we show a vulva. And it was crushing because it's like, this is not a vulva that is sexualized. The entire film is there to sort of provide context for why we're vulva. And then it feels like to remove it, you're sort of, it's like, I don't know how better to describe it, but sort of like a slap in the face of the ethos of what the film was trying to achieve, which is to say that this is not this is a body part that like exists. So we're not trying to hide it. We should be able to like perceive it visually, and we can't. Something that we would talk about, and that I feel frustrated about. You actually see penises in films all the time, right? And in TV shows, you can go into like a regular movie theater, watch an R movie, and there's a penis. And I'm sure that there is some art house film that has a vagina in it. There's probably several, but in terms of like mainstream content, you know, you're not going to go on like HBO and see a vagina. Like maybe someone's probably going to call me out and said they've seen it. I haven't seen it. And I actually can't give you a good reason for why. And the fact that our film was so censored when that double standard very much exists, it's not like there's not a precedent for showing genitals on film. It's just a certain form of genitals. And so I don't know that I have all the answers. The film definitely provokes a lot of questions, and I hope that it continues to. And it exists online right now on Vimeo. And very sadly, it exists in a form where there's no vulvas because we weren't allowed to put it up because it was seen as too sexually explicit.
What all streaming platforms used, the official statement was that it crossed community guidelines. And so I think that those community guidelines like appear across the board for all online streaming platforms. I'm sure that there are really community guidelines for what they're referencing, but at some point, Aurora and we came to this crossroads where we had to make a decision whether we wanted to keep the integrity of the film in its purest form, which was to show the vulva fully, or if we wanted to actually get it seen by as many people as possible, which in today's day and age is online. That's where people are watching things, much more than indie art house film festivals, as wonderful as they are. When you're talking about the general public, people who don't have access to cinemas or can't afford to go to a cinema or can't afford tickets, you know. So it was an interesting conversation that we had because we had to really like assess, I think, our own ethics and morals when it came to the film, but then also trying to be realistic about what it means to distribute films in today's age, you know, which is that we still come against these so-called community guidelines.
Mm-hmm. Was that the same with the New York Times when they were distributing it?
So this film was not on the New York Times. This film is ultimately just ended up on Vimeo. I had a conversation with someone who I will not name not too long ago who had worked for one of these platforms that I will not name, who told me that he had actually come across it when I have not told you about this, Jessie, but who told me that he had crossed it when we had initially submitted to be on one of these platforms. And he's like, you know, at the time, I hadn't really been exposed to any kind of content like this before, and I didn't know what to do with it, and it made me uncomfortable. So I didn't recommend it went further. And and then he said, you know, now looking back, I feel regret about not supporting the film. And he was like, I just had never been. It was a man, and he was like, I had never been exposed to something like this, and I think it just kind of scared me, and so I just buried it. And he confessed that to me. And I was like heartbroken. But it's also like, I think it really confirmed our suspicions about like, why is this not moving forward? We know it's a really beautiful film. And we felt very strongly about it. and it elicited a lot of positive reactions from people who did see it. Yeah, I think it's just there is that visceral, I'm uncomfortable. This is eliciting a reaction in me that I'm not sure how to place. It's confronting, and I'd rather not engage with it.
Yeah, and I think that it's confronting for all people who are watching it. It's like it's for men, it's for women, because for women or who can identify who have the internal genitalia, it's confrontational in terms of discussing openly these taboo topics and literally spreading your legs. And then for men, they often feel confronted because they've either not had these conversations or the certain topics that are raised they feel like target them or something like that. So it's a good confrontational, but I do feel like it confronts every single person. Like there's no one person who can watch the film and feel like at ease with everything, you know. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Maybe there are people who will watch it and be like, whatever.
What kind of conversations do you hope this film will spark among viewers going forward, and especially the college students who are going to watch this in our Repro Film and Wisp collaborative screenings?
I don't know that I feel prescriptive about the conversation I hope it sparks. I think part of me, this is a term that Jessie and I use, it sparks a little bit of delight in terms of the kind of conversations you can have around your body. I think, especially at like a college age, that's when I remember a lot of narratives beginning to emerge where people are being encouraged to speak openly about sexual assault, because there's a lot of sexual assault on college campuses. And I think that this film can definitely be a starting point for initiating a conversation about something like that. But I also think that there's a lot of delight in speaking about, like, I remember like I was like masturbating in the fourth grade, and I thought it was my dirty little secret, and like I had discovered this amazing thing, and I was like both felt shame but also like sad for any other kid who like didn't know what that was. And but that was something I never shared at the time. And I also think that there's room for like speaking about our vulvas, our vaginas, whatever, in ways that like are playful and are about like centering our pleasure and our joy, and that it doesn't just have to be a catalyst for speaking about traumas, which are also very important. But I also think sometimes the trauma is the center of the conversation instead of like our pleasure. And I hope it also encourages people, there's the stigmatization, of course, about sharing about difficult experiences, but also about sharing about the pleasurable ones, because I think that that's incredibly important as well in an appropriate setting, you know.
Or an inappropriate setting. Just to add to it,
like at work.
What is appropriate and what inappropriate? Yeah, the best conversations that I've had with people who've watched the film are like in open spaces, like in restaurants, discussing some of the most intimate but joyful things about the body and like things that we experienced growing up. But yeah, just to echo Aurora, I wholeheartedly agree with everything that Aurora said, and I have nothing else to add other than the inappropriate setting.
One of the things I love about the film is the intergenerational aspect of community that you see in this workshop. Talk to me about that and how we can have those intergenerational conversations around our bodies and shame and dismantling that, because, you know, we all grow up with this idea of our bodies being taboo, but it is so different for our mothers or our grandmothers compared to the younger generation coming up. How did that factor into your storytelling?
I mean, I feel like I'm a broken record, like to all of your questions. I'm just like, that's so complicated, because it is complicated. So within the film itself, obviously there's an intergenerational aspect in the sense that you, as you correctly pointed out, you see the representation of older bodied people and younger bodied people sharing the same space, talking openly about their experiences. And in fact, the older person that you see in the film is actually a woman named Carol Downer. And she, I mean, this is so embarrassing to admit, but seeing as this is a safe space and in the spirit of being honest and open, Aurora and I had no idea who she was when she walked into the class. We were filming and she walked in like 10 minutes late, and we looked at each other and we were like, who is this rude person who just stumbled into our onto our shoot, like just like out of nowhere, unannounced? And she sat down and she was like participating, and then to our absolute surprise, got up onto the couch, spread her legs, and shared her story. And it was sometime around the moment of sharing, or maybe just before, that I think one of the doulas pulled us aside and told us who she was. And so basically, she's a huge feminist icon for anyone who's listening or watching this, you can Google her name, who was involved with reproductive health justice movements in the 60s and the 70s in America. And is really like one of like the founding figures of this movement. And so it was a real full circle moment to have her representationally in there, both as representing someone older bodied, but then also representing someone who has been around advocating for this work for such a long time and pioneering it to a degree also. And then, of course, you see younger people, you see more middle-aged people, which I think is also great. I think often middle-aged people are actually the ones who are left out of the conversation. So I think that was really great to see a lot of middle-aged moms in particular there. That was fantastic. And then younger moms, and then women who aren't mothers or haven't birthed children themselves. And I would love to say that we can take full what's the word? Full credit for that. But to be honest, it was completely up to Pam and Michael in terms of the people that they pulled and asked to come to the class. And it was complete chance and luck that we were able to get such a wide variety of people representing, in the actual film. On the other hand, when you look at the people watching it, I think that, as Aurora mentioned, you get an older generation that are able to access these stories either through Carol, an older person, or through younger people, because ultimately, just because you're an older bodied person doesn't necessarily mean that you will relate more with the older bodied person's narrative. It could be that parent is sitting watching this film and they really resonate with the woman in her early 20s who is telling her story about an abortion that she had, And so I think that that's wonderful, because I think that the class, by bringing everyone together, it really cuts across age barriers and boundaries in that sense, where it really does feel like a collective experience where you're able to engage with the stories that you resonate the most with, irrespective of age, class, and so on.
I think that's it's almost so ironic that Carol is depicted in the film, and for most audiences, they would think, oh wow, who is this older woman who's just remarkably comfortable with her body, not realizing she's actually the person who sort of designed this class. Because Carol, since the 60s, began gathering groups together, and this is all sort of like by Carol's design, and Pam, the woman who teaches the class now, was sort of an apprentice of Carol, and Carol passed the knowledge to her. And so it's so funny, because it seems like, oh, who are maybe these young progressive people who are like bringing this older woman into the fold and like, encouraging this conversation, when in reality, she is the person that sort of really brought everyone there. In a way, it's sad that in fact context isn't able to be in the film, but I also think it's like really beautiful that is information that's simmering beneath the surface. It was amazing to have her there. I mean, even though of course she's is like this feminist icon, she also speaks to the reality of her time and maybe to the present day, because she expresses that, she didn't have, is this in the film? That she never had an orgasm until she was 30. Even what didn't make it into the film, she shared a lot about, her experiences growing up in the time she grew up in, and what was the presumed relationships that one should have with their body. And so I love that the film sort of speaks across generations, and older women who know the history of this class are like, this isn't new. And yet it feels like something that is as relevant today as it was in, 50 years, 60 years ago.
And those classes were like badass and underground. Like they were like super secretive.
I guess they could have been arrested at that time, like maybe public indecency, or who knows, like the laws would have been so different.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Carol did get arrested a few times, actually, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, I think it's really interesting because like in so many ways, like legally, like you're able to have these gatherings. Like it's not like anyone's going to get arrested for being in the class, but we still come into contact and come up against, we are taught how to not speak about our bodies, and for a lot of women, how to hate our bodies and hate our vaginas and hate our vulvas. And so, as Aurora said, it's just as relevant now as it was all the time back then in the 60s.
Yeah, that's so beautiful and powerful. And I love the dynamic range of stories and experiences being shared in that room. And it just makes you think of your own experiences, like Aurora, you were talking about. And, we can all conjure up those memories and kind of hold it. It's almost like, these women are holding up mirrors to their vulvas, but we can hold this film up as a mirror to ourselves and our own experiences. And so I'm really thankful that it is out in the world and that people are able to see a version of it, even if it's not the pure version. They can still see it, take in the message, and see how it can apply to their lives. So Jessie and Aurora, thank you so much for your time. But before we go, I want to ask, what are you both working on now or next, and where can we follow you?
I haven't caught up with Aurora in like months, and so I'm also like, what are you working on? What are you up to?
I know, I'm literally wondering the same thing.
Should I leave the Zoom room and you guys can?
No, if you leave the Zoom room, we'll be talking for hours. You don't know Aurora and I. We are chatterboxes.
I am currently fighting tooth and nail to try and direct my first feature documentary. It's a struggle to get funding for certain kinds of stories, and I've been struggling to get funding for this one, but I am. The working title is called Dear You. It may change. And then I'm also working on a couple of different shorts that are pretty early. And you can probably, the best place to follow what I'm doing is, I guess, my Instagram. I can say what it is. It feels so embarrassing. My Instagram is Aurora Bobora, like AURA BOBORA. That would be the best place. Or my full name, Aurora Brachman, is my website. So occasionally I update that, but Instagram is probably the best place.
I'm working on a very exciting feature documentary about one of the most famous female artists, singers, musicians in South Africa, whose name I cannot say right now because we're in the development phase and we're still ironing certain things out. Because everyone in South Africa knows her, and so as soon as I say her name, it would get out there. South Africa is a very small place in many ways. But it's a very exciting project. She's a very private person, and so this will be like one of the first real sort of films documenting her life, which is equal parts inspiring and also really interesting from a post-democratic perspective in South Africa, because she was born in 1994, so was I. So in South Africa, that was when our first democratic elections were. And she has a fascinating story. And then you can follow me on Instagram/TikTok. On Instagram, it's just Jessie Zinn. Oh, I've also got a podcast. It's called I Love Me More, and it's where I interview women and femmes in the South African creative space. So whether it's musicians or artists or filmmakers. And so that's also on my Instagram if people want to see. And then on TikTok, it's just Jessie_Zinn. And I make silly price comparison videos. It's very serious documentary work.
Well, I can't wait to see both of the projects that you're working on, and please keep us posted. And thank you for making the gallery that destroys all shame and for all the conversations and impact that is happening around it. Jessie Zinn and Aurora Brachman, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you want to watch The Gallery That Destroys All Shame, check it out on Vimeo. If you like what you just heard and want to listen to even more creative conversations with filmmakers, activists, and repro health experts, you can sign up for the free Repro periodical at reprofilm.org, where you will receive every episode of the podcast straight to your inbox every month. Thank you to our partners at Wisp who offer healthcare on your terms. Check them out at hellowisp.com. The Repro Film Podcast is executive produced by Mama Film, hosted and produced by me, Asha Dyer, edited by Kylie Brown, with original music by Paris Jane and Maurice Anthony. You can find us on social media at ReproFilm on Instagram and on our YouTube channel at ReproFilm.org. Be sure to share this episode with a friend and help us spread the ReproFilm message and mission.